Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Labour Campaign for Human Rights event. It's very nice to have you here, and also very strange to have you here and not be able to see everyone who's also here at the webinar today. First of all, I think it's worth me just kind of saying hello and welcome you to our latest event. We've been putting on a few webinars over the last few years, especially in the last year as COVID has obviously shut down our in-person events. But today we are extremely honoured to be hosting an event in partnership with Amnesty International. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to attend and discuss what is an increasingly and concerning situation in Bangladesh, one which Amnesty so aptly describes in their latest briefing as a crackdown on the freedom of dissent online. My name is Olivia Williams. I am the chair of the event today, and I also lead the LCHR's foreign policy campaign, Britain and Her Allies. In 2019, we launched a briefing which considered the relationship between Britain and Bangladesh. At that time, the Digital Security Act was a law that had been criticised as draconian by activists, the media, international lawyers, and the opposition party had been in operation for just a year. Even in January 2019, there was already great concerns that the Digital Security Act not only retains some of the previous Information and Communication Technology Act's problematic provisions, but it added more provisions that would criminalise peaceful speech. It was argued that the Digital Security Act would not only repeat the mistakes of the Information and Communication Security Technology Act, but exacerbate them. Now, as we revisit the Digital Security Act 2.5 years later, it is apparent that our fears and concerns have been confirmed. Bangladeshi authorities have imprisoned at least 433 individuals under the country's Digital Security Act as of the 11th of July 2021. Most of these prisoners are held for allegedly publishing offensive and false information online. More than 1,300 cases have been filed against about 2,000 people, and nearly 1,000 people have been arrested since the law was enacted in October 2019. We know that the Digital Security Act has been increasingly used to stifle dissent online, on social media, on websites and other digital platforms with punishments that go up to life in prison. So today we are here to kind of have a panel event in response to this act. We think it's very important that our voices can be heard and should be joined together and reverberate for change and put pressure on the Bangladeshi authorities to end these violations. And I truly do hope the event today will strengthen existing conversations and create new ones. So today I wanted to firstly just to advertise the fact that we're here to celebrate Amnesty's incredible briefing, which considers the stories of 10 activists who are either currently detained or have been detained because of the Digital Security Act. I would really encourage you to take a read of the briefing. We linked it on the Eventbrite page. There's also a petition that you can sign up to, which I can send around after this. And there is also there's some amazing infographics as well that I can share, that you can share on your social media channels after the event. So kind of without further ado, it's probably best to introduce our panelists that are with us here today. We have Shailal Alam, who is a renowned Bangladeshi photojournalist and a Time Person of the Year, who has experienced the repressive Bangladeshi authorities firsthand. We also have Huma Khan, who is a senior human rights advisor to the UN in Bangladesh, who has remained active and vocal on the issues of sexual violence, arbitrary detention, and the targeting of minorities throughout her career. On behalf of Amnesty, we have Jerry Allen, who is the Bangladesh country coordinator at Amnesty UK, who oversees all Bangladesh-related voluntary campaigning work. And we also finally have Stephen Kinnock MP, who is the Shadow Minister for Asia and the Pacific, who has worked with LCHR on and has been a strong and active voice in calling for the release of the photojournalist Kajol. Kajol was similarly detained under the Digital Security Act last year. So that's everything from me. In terms of housekeeping, it's worth mentioning that I will shortly ask each panelist to give a short kind of opening statement on their thoughts around the Digital Security Act and why they're here today. We will then move into questions from me, but I don't want to take up too much of the time of my questions. So after about 20 minutes or so, I'm then going to open the questions to the floor. The way in which you might want to answer or ask questions today is that I would like you to pop it in the chat. I will then monitor the chat. And then if the question is directed at a particular panelist, please do let me know for your question. And then also if you're associated with any organization, and it'd be great to kind of understand kind of where you are and why you're asking such question. So thank you very much. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Shahidul Alam for his kind of opening remarks.
Thank you, Olivia. You've already given us a background on the law itself, and we could, of course, discuss this ludicrous catch-all law. But you know, one should really only expect reasonable laws from legitimate government. So I do have a slight take on that. But since I'm the only Bangladeshi in this panel, I'd like to provide some context. I think that would be useful for the group at large. We speak in hushed tones. We constantly look over our shoulders. Before any serious conversation in Bangladesh, if people get together, they first put away their mobile phones. We teach our children to be careful. We tell them not to share about what they share with friends, about what they share on social media. Murderers are let loose by the police and the media. 86 victims of enforced disappearance are still missing from the past year, and our foreign minister just brushes it off. The police and the media instead whip up frenzy over loose women. This is what we've achieved from 50 years of independence. Now, we need to take it into context. We've had extrajudicial killings ever since our nation was formed. I'm not talking of specific communities like the Ahmadiyya who are persecuted, but the general public. The President's Order number 16 of 1973 was an indemnity act introduced to prevent those who may have been involved in war crimes from being tried. The infamous Rokhibahini Act and the Special Powers Act were both introduced in 1974, shortly after independence. The Rokhibahini Act decreed members would remain immune from any judicial supervision in all activities in which they'd indulge in good faith. I'm saying some of this because this thing about indemnity, the fact that some people are beyond the law, is, I think, at the root of much of what's happening. On the 25th of January 1975, Bangladesh Sheikh Mujibur Rahman declared a state of emergency, and his political supporters approved a constitutional amendment banning all opposition political parties. Mujib was declared president for life and given extraordinary powers. It took just 15 minutes for Parliament to pass this hugely controversial bill. The Rokhibahini and Mujib Bahini were effectively Mujib's private armies, much like the police is today for the ruling party. It's worth reflecting that had Mujib been alive now, he would have, at the age of 100, been Bangladesh's president in a presidential form of government. There have been changes of government after Mujib's assassination, but the successive governments have done little to redeem themselves. Ershad struck a blow to secularism when he made Islam the state religion. Zia gave immunity to the killers of Mujib. Khaleda introduced the Rapid Action Battalion, which we call RAB. The international community, including Britain, worked behind the scenes to install a military-backed caretaker government. So really, no one's hands are clean. And indemnity didn't end there. The Joint Drive Indemnity Act of 2003 for Operation Clean Heart was only declared illegal by the High Court in 2015. But I believe we need to go beyond that. It's a culture of impunity, I think, which is as much to blame as the laws of indemnity which allow it to happen, and the other repressive laws that, like the Digital Security Act, that we need to look at. The ICT Act in 2016 fast-tracked us into the digital repression age. And then we had recorded teleconversations, mainly of politicians, which began to come up. Though sources are still unclear, it's undeniable that without a well-equipped surveillance system, such conversations cannot be tracked. The recent reference to the purchase of spyware from Israel clearly points fingers. Though here too, the Home Minister was in complete denial. That's a standard response from the government. Any such surveillance is a clear violation of the ICT Act itself. But even that doesn't seem to matter. The law knows when to look away. Section 86 also provides indemnity to public servants involved while implementing this act, as any act against them will be any action against them will be punishable by the act itself. Section 80 allowed them to arrest anyone, anywhere, without any warrant. We were screaming blue, but who was going to listen to the stakeholders? The government moved forward with these amendments in the name of ensuring transparency and accountability. They extended imprisonment instead and awarded yet more powers to law enforcement agencies. We had a lovely piece out today in the Daily Star called Lessons from Bangladesh Today. It's by a professor, Ahrar Ahmed. It's a witty piece, tongue-in-cheek, cleverly using metaphors, which every Bangladeshi would understand without directly naming anyone. He was playing safe. But even such pieces are extremely rare. People are just too scared. I'm speaking to you now, but it was this month, 3 years ago, when I've been reporting on the road safety movement, when there were government thugs supported by the police who were attacking unarmed students demanding safer roads. I was live on Facebook reporting and later spoke to Al Jazeera from this chair. I was picked up from this very flat. It was roughly at this time when we are speaking that I was blindfolded, handcuffed, and being tortured. That is the reality we're living in. And the government is in complete denial. We cannot now question history. Journalists cannot report on corruption. You cannot critique people in power. And while I was in jail, they introduced the Digital Security Act that you were talking about, Olivia. I got arrested in August. The law came in October 2018. Though civil society opposed it vehemently, we were expecting reforms instead. The new law criminalizes defamation. But recently, we had a woman and her daughter who were tortured in broad daylight by a union chairman, a government appointee, representative, well, elected, I suppose, but still representing the government in practice in our country because we've never had elections, and paraded through the villages with through their village with their hands tied by ropes. We were defamed by politicians regularly. None of this seems to matter. The law very conveniently looks away when this happens. But then this government doesn't really need the law. In fact, it doesn't even need my vote, as it can win elections and do what it does anyway. But then we can't behave in the same manner. We have a need to behave differently. That's why we need legal reform. That's why I think what we're talking today is so important. We need the law to be scrapped, but we need it to be scrapped so we have a realistic chance to fight these injustices using not the tools that they've used, but civilized tools. I'll end with that. I'll pass it on.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. I'd now like to invite Jerry Allen, please, on behalf of Amnesty, to give his opening statement.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I am the chair of the Amnesty UK Country Coordinators. Country coordinators work with researchers in the Amnesty International offices to engage UK activists on their specific countries. I have specific responsibility for Bangladesh, where I have worked. Amnesty UK is concerned at the repressive nature of the actions taken under the Digital Security Act. Amnesty has found that 80% of those arrested or charged under the DSA were people sharing messages of dissent or satire of powerful people. We are particularly alarmed by accounts from survivors of enforced disappearance, torture, and other ill treatment. The writer Mushtaq Ahmed died in prison after being in detention for 10 months without trial. We urge Bangladesh to repeal the Digital Security Act or to amend it in line with international human rights treaties and in line with the commitment Bangladesh made at the Universal Periodic Review to protect the right to freedom of expression. There have been 1,300 cases raised against 2,000 people. There have been high-profile cases against journalists and political leaders. Amnesty highlights the cases of 10 individuals who have been subjected to enforced disappearance, arbitrary detention, and torture simply for criticizing powerful people on social media. I want to draw your attention to 2 of these cases. Abu Zaman, a farmer, was charged with defamation for sharing a Facebook post, even though he cannot read or write and has no knowledge of Facebook. He could face up to 10 years in jail if convicted. Mohammed Iman is 15. He saw a Facebook post making a sarcastic comment about the Prime Minister and shared it to get likes from his friends. He deleted the post within an hour and wrote an apology on the advice of others. But a leader of the youth wing of the ruling Awami League filed a case. Mohammed was accused of publishing false and defamatory information that could deteriorate law and order under the Digital Security Act. After a very stressful year, the police have filed criminal charges. 8 of the 10 highlighted cases have been filed by members of the ruling Awami League party or by law enforcement officials. In recent years, the youth wing of the Awami League have been able to violently suppress dissent, and they appear to have impunity. Previous governments also used similar methods to suppress dissent. Repression in Bangladesh is not new. The Digital Security Act is vague. To quote Shahidul, it is a vague, rambling, catch-all law open to all sorts of interpretation. So what can UK activists do? I'm usually asked this question at these types of meetings. We have an online petition. It will send a message to the Bangladesh Prime Minister to repeal or amend the Digital Security Act, to decriminalize defamation, and to release all persons accused under the DSA for exercising their right to freedom of expression. The number of signatures obtained by the online petition in the UK will be published on the 15th of December. This is a day before Victory Day, when Bangladesh celebrates its independence. This petition will highlight UK support for freedom of expression in Bangladesh. We also call on the UK government to condemn the crackdown on freedom of expression in Bangladesh. We have a model letter that you can send to your MP. It will raise awareness of the issues, and it will ask the UK government to encourage the Bangladesh government to protect and promote the right to freedom of expression. If you send me an email, I can send you the model letter. It does not have to be sent as an Amnesty letter. In the long term, Amnesty UK would welcome more support for its campaigns on Bangladesh and other South Asia issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerry. That was really illuminating. I'd like to pass the conch to Hua, please. Thank you.
I hope I'm audible. You can hear me. Thank you for the opportunity this evening to speak on Digital Security Act, and what I was asked to look at particularly is how international law can help bringing people to account. Unfortunately, international law, international human rights law is very much embedded in this structure of UN, which is about member states committing themselves to certain standards and principles. Bangladesh as a country has committed itself to a number of UN conventions, namely ICCPR, which is on civil and political rights, economic social rights, Convention Against Torture, and several other conventions. Bangladesh is a signatory to them and has even ratified some of the optional protocols. So that is the framework under which international human rights law operates. Bangladesh has been reviewed under UPR as mentioned by the speaker before. And two international mechanisms I would like to highlight here, which is one is UPR, in which there was a clear recommendation to review DSA to bring it in compliance with international standards, which was a recommendation accepted by Bangladesh, because in UPR process, member states have the opportunity to either accept or not accept the recommendation. Bangladesh accepted this recommendation to review DSA. Similarly, Committee on Torture has also given a clear recommendation on the issue of DSA and allegations of torture that have stemmed from people who've been arrested under DSA. The other mechanism that we often use is special procedures, in which independent experts will write, who are mandated on a specific topic, would write to the member state and ask for action. There have been a number of communications with government of Bangladesh on various cases, whether it was of Shahidul Alam, whether it was of Mushtaq or Kishore, so many communications, because the idea is that once the communication goes, the government would respond and look at the problems in handling of a specific case. So special procedures is normally on specific cases. There have been also public statements issued by a number of independent experts asking government to review or repeal DSA. Similarly, the High Commissioner has made a number of statements, has written letter to the government of Bangladesh on this, on the review of DSA. So there are a number of appeals, there are a number of actions that have been taken on the side of the various mechanisms that exist. However, we've had very little response from the government of Bangladesh. And as I said, because these commitments are voluntary. So when a country ratifies a convention or allows itself or accepts any international standard, it is primarily a voluntary pledge. The problem in this case has been that there has been little response to all these appeals. So there are two, we can see very clear distinction between what is the international presentation and what is being applied domestically. There is a big gap in what is happening, in what is being said or at various international platforms. And then its domestic application is completely another, at a different level. And that is a very challenging situation for us. At this point, I also want to say that when it comes to issues, I mean, broadly speaking, not only about Bangladesh, when it comes to issue of enforceability of any of these mechanisms, freedom of expression is not a topic which has a number of possibilities in terms of pushing the member state to take an action. In this context, I can only think of, which is a very, very distant mechanism, but only possibility that comes to mind, which has possibly not been tried, is sanctions, which is, again, as I said, it requires a number of, a lot of documentation, proof, individuals. So I'm not necessarily saying yes or no for that, but that seems like a possibility which could also be explored in terms of international law, not specific to any particular country, but I'm just trying to list all the possibilities that are there in the international law. Unfortunately, it's also a trend in the region. If we look at the region, we have similar legislations, we have more or less similar pattern of crackdown on civil society and civic space in the region. So I also feel that while it's important to address the issues of Bangladesh specifically, because they're specific to Bangladesh, some regional approaches would also be helpful in terms of advocacy and campaigning, because it's not limited to Bangladesh, but more or less it's a regional issue that has worsened in last years. Over the years, it's been worsening. So that's the other approach that I wanted to suggest. I would stop here in terms of the possibilities, and then perhaps questions will help us understand a bit more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Huma. That was really interesting. I'd like to pass over to Stephen Kinnock now to give us a bit more of a UK policy perspective, and what can we do?
Well, thank you very much, Olivia, and many thanks to the Labour Campaign for Human Rights and to Amnesty for the opportunity to speak with you today on this vitally important issue. And I'd just like to start by saying I agree with every word of what's been said by the previous speakers who've set out some of the key issues and challenges that we're facing when it comes to freedom of expression in Bangladesh. And there's no doubt at all that the Labour Party takes these issues very seriously indeed. We're an internationalist party and we stand up for the global principles of international law and human rights. We also believe in defending democracy, even though we know that there are certainly many countries where democracy doesn't exist. We're certainly not in the business of trying to impose our values or our systems on any other country, but we do believe that you need to stand up for those people who are trying to defend human rights. And of course, the freedom, the right to free speech is absolutely at the heart of that. We're seeing in so many countries across the world, tragically really, that these freedoms are being rolled back. A recent study by the University of Gothenburg demonstrated that for the first time since 2001, the number of authoritarian countries outnumbers the democracies around the world. So we're actually going in the wrong direction in terms of democracy and human rights and freedom of expression being a crucially important part of that. So this is a global issue. We've of course seen high profile incidents and coup d'etat in places like Burma. We of course have seen the huge developments in Afghanistan over recent days and weeks, and we're very worried that there is a global trend that is moving in the wrong direction and does seem to be affecting countries like Bangladesh. We've seen an increasing authoritarian tendency in Sri Lanka under Rapaska, in India under Modi. The export of the mainland China model to Hong Kong is well underway. We've even seen, I think, some tendencies in places like the United States and the United Kingdom in terms of certain squeezing of media freedoms and to some extent disregarding the international rule of law. So there's real concerns right across the world, but specifically focusing on Bangladesh today. We have been working quite a lot with the Labour Campaign for Human Rights. I've been raising this issue with the government. We're very worried that Bangladesh has recently dropped to 151 out of 180 countries in the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index. And of course, the excellent report that Amnesty has published only really adds to these concerns. And on top of that, really, which is really giving this whole issue a huge push, is the Digital Security Act, which has already been discussed at some length. So I don't need to go into detail about it, but it is notable that Reporters Without Borders described it as a tailor-made judicial weapon for silencing troublesome journalists. And we've seen victims of that law, that many of them are listed, and we really see the personal heartbreaking stories that are in Amnesty's report, including, of course, the tragic case of Mushtaq Ahmed, who died in prison after being held for 10 months for criticizing the government's handling of the pandemic. Another victim who I've actually been doing quite a lot of work around this case is the recently bailed Shafiqul Islam Kajol, a very well-respected journalist who spent 237 days in what can only be described as arbitrary detention after being arrested following a mysterious 53-day disappearance. We think that the arrest is connected to sharing a Facebook post, which is extremely worrying. And I've been working on this case with the Labour Campaign for Human Rights. I've written to the government twice, first to Nigel Adams, the Minister for Asia in the Commons, and then to Lord Ahmad, the Minister for South Asia in the Commonwealth, who sits in the House of Lords. I'm afraid I've received nothing of any note. Nigel Adams did reply to my first letter and sort of talked in a very vague way about the importance of freedom of expression, but made no reference to the specific case of Kajol, even though that was the actual topic of my letter. And I have yet to receive a response to my other letter. I've written to the Bangladeshi High Commissioner twice and received no reply. And I've also asked specific written questions. And at the end of March, Lisa Nandi and I, Lisa being our shadow foreign secretary, met with Pollock, who is Kajol's son, to hear a bit more about his case and to see what we might be able to do to press the government further. So I've been deeply, deeply disappointed by the response, or lack of response, I should say, from the British government. They seem to be turning a blind eye to this issue. They are not raising the question of the digital security law. As far as I know, they certainly haven't given me an indication that they've done that. But I've asked another parliamentary question, and the answer is due to me in September when Parliament returns from recess. I think there's another question as well about this media freedom coalition that the British government has convened, but it's not entirely clear to me. There's 42 countries, including some G7 countries. What is that coalition actually doing? What is the UK government actually doing to show leadership and drive its work forward? So I'd find it useful to talk perhaps today and more broadly about how we can shine a light on the Media Freedom Coalition, which sounds like a great idea on paper, but what is actually happening in practice is the big question. So I think there's many other ways that the international community, including the British government, should be putting pressure on the Bangladeshi government. And I think the Amnesty report gives us a great place to start with that, with some very clear asks and recommendations. I mean, for me, there's sort of four that stood out. One around demanding the immediate and unconditional release and dropping of all charges against all those accused solely for exercising their right to freedom of expression. The amendment of the Digital Security Act in line with international human rights law and standards, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which Bangladesh is a signatory. The decriminalization of defamation, so that defamation is treated as a matter of civil litigation, which would bring it in line with international human rights standards, again to which Bangladesh is a signatory. And seeing the end of this practice of unlawful arrest, which Kajol has clearly been a victim of, and under the Digital Security Act, in line with Article 9 of ICCPR, and in line with the directive of the Appellate Division of the Supreme Court of Bangladesh. So I think what would be good is to say, well, are these the sort of top priority recommendations? And if so, what more could we be doing to press the UK government and the international community to take action? So once again, thank you very much to LCHR and to Amnesty and to all the other panelists for their excellent contributions, and very happy to take questions. I should just say, I'm afraid I have to leave promptly at about 6:25 because I'm also dealing with Afghanistan as part of my geographical brief. So as you can imagine, there's a lot going on, and we've got a call at 6:30. So, but I'm very, very much looking forward to having a discussion now for the next 20 minutes or so for myself anyway. Thank you very much, Olivia. Back to you.
Fantastic. And to any audience members, if you've got any questions specifically for Stephen this evening, if you'd like to get them across to us before he leaves, we can try and make sure we get those and ask them to him. But I want to begin actually by taking it a step back a notch. And Stephen, you did mention about another minister talking about the Digital Security Act and freedom of expression in a very vague way. And this is probably one for Shidal here, but I kind of want to play devil's advocate. And before we kind of start to talk about how and why the Digital Security Act restricts freedom of expression, why in the context of Bangladesh is freedom of expression so important in the first place?
Is that directed at me or anyone?
I thought I could direct it at you first, and then if anyone else would like to kind of take the floor with it as well, then please feel free. I'd much prefer it to be a conversation rather than just me directing questions at everybody.
Well, primarily, I mean, we are in a very fearful environment. People are scared. What's happened to people generally is worrying, and I as a Bangladeshi actually do worry about the fact that you have people protesting in Myanmar, you have people protesting even in Afghanistan right now, yet in Bangladesh, it's very, very difficult getting people to speak out. The level of repression, I mean, I spent some time talking about how this thing has evolved, but it's never been anywhere as bad as this. And I mean, even people within the ruling party, when you get them outside of their sheltered spaces, will admit that it's never been like this at all. There's no democracy even within the party itself. They can't speak to one another. And I think when this is happening, what has happened primarily is all the state institutions have been demolished. You know, the police is a private army. The judiciary is obviously not free. The bureaucracy plays to the tune. So where do we as citizens turn to? And there, when you've got a law that prevents any sort of protest whatsoever, several of these have been protests about, you know, at a time like COVID, when there is so much that has to be done, when people are complaining about illegal things happening with COVID vaccine, with the money being diverted, they're the ones being put in jail. So really, it's a very, very scary situation. But to me personally, I think the most important area is, at the moment, the media has been completely stymied. The media has a very, very important role to play. And today, we're at a stage where the media has become an extension of the government. It's become a spokesperson for the government, except for very few important exceptions. All they're doing is regurgitating government policy and government handout.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I don't know if he's frozen or I'll pick this up. I mean, as Shida was saying, even if all of these institutions have completely broken down, Huma, is there any way realistically in which the average person or the average citizen can actually access these international mechanisms that you say are in place that kind of countries and governments might be able to use? But what about the individual person? What's left for them if they've found themselves in this situation?
The average person is free to use international mechanisms. Of course, the information level is not equal across the country, but there are NGOs who would be willing to help and do help people. But the problem remains that the response or action has to go back to the government itself, because even international mechanisms ask, request, put pressure, inquire from the government itself. They are not free to take any action in a specific case because they don't have jurisdiction over what is happening in Bangladesh in terms of legal jurisdiction to take up a case. So the problem lies more with the lack of action and lack of response. I mean, just to give an example at this forum, that Bangladesh has 18 requests from various special procedures and independent experts to visit the country, and they have allowed no special rapporteur since 2016, except the special rapporteur in Myanmar, because that position is very specific to Myanmar related issues. So access is one issue, but then the response is also another challenge.
Thank you so much. And just for any of the other panelists, if you want to come in at all on any of these questions, I do invite you to take the floor.
Well, Olivia, just to add a point on why freedom of expression matters so much, and I think it's important to underline the fact that it's not some abstract concept that doesn't connect to the real world and to people's real lives. In fact, it really does, because it's about scrutiny, and scrutiny improves the quality of decisions that are being made. If there's no accountability and no scrutiny, those who are in power rapidly become lazy and complacent and corrupt. And that has real world impact in terms of the decisions that are being made, in terms of resources that get stolen, in terms of the way in which people's lives are not served, and their families and their interests and their communities are not served by their government. So the point of a free press is to have people who will speak truth to power and will ask the right questions, searching questions, which occasionally do create a scandal for a government, but that's the only way that governments learn and improve and change. So I think it's really important to always connect freedom of expression to people's real world and real life experiences and what's actually happening in a country, both in terms of its economy and its society. So yes, it's an important human right, but it's also a very, very important part of good governance and delivering good outcomes for the people that the government is supposed to be serving.
Great, thank you. Yeah, of course, go for it.
Yeah, just to add to that, Stephen, thank you for that comment. What is talked about a lot now, because people have their backs against the wall, people are really scared and upset and dissatisfied with the way things are going. But when people talk of regime change, I have a problem with that, because regime change in itself isn't going to solve anything unless there's a systemic change to this process. I think anyone who comes into power where there's no accountability will behave in that sort of a manner, or will eventually become corrupted. So sure, we have an extremely corrupt and extremely authoritarian government which needs to be curbed, but I think simply thinking in terms of replacing it is a very short-sighted goal. I think there needs to be systemic changes, and as Steve mentioned, freedom of expression is fundamental to creating the mechanism whereby the people who are governed have to be, there has to be a check and balance, and that people who are governed have a say in the process of governance.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question that's come in from the chat, and it's from Rakbul Robin, who has said, I'm a British Bangladeshi and all my life I have lived in London. So recently, because I have shared a video about Bangladesh human rights on my Facebook, after a few days, the local police officer in Bangladesh went to look for me in my dad's home. Is it safe for me to travel back to Bangladesh? To make clear, I think his dad is based in Bangladesh and the police went to go find him in Bangladesh and he's worried to go back. Does anyone have any advice for Rakbul?
Sorry, I'm hugging up this space, but if it's any consolation, he's not on his own. There are so many people who are in exile right now for that reason. And being in exile isn't sufficient because they have family back home and they're worried. And this is exactly what's going on. So we're in a police state and there is really no easy answer to this situation. And okay, imagine what's happening, how scared people are who are within the country. I'm really sad to say, but I do not see what those things can be, except that I, as a Bangladeshi, will appeal to my fellow Bangladeshis that we have to resist. I think we can only, freedom doesn't come by itself. It has to be gained, it has to be earned. And we've fought a war of liberation for a nation that believed in freedom, and we are letting it slip.
Thank you. Huma, I was wondering if you have any advice at all, actually, seeing as you are our resident legal expert.
I would rather discuss this bilaterally because there are a lot of security concerns possibly for him and his family. So happy to connect bilaterally. Sorry for this.
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, I think it's also quite interesting to look at because the Digital Security Act has obviously led to so many more human rights abuses that's not just around freedom of expression. And what is it that allows the Digital Security Act to be used in such a way that it allows for further human rights violations? I open it to the floor, really.
I'll come in again if no one's doing it, but I just don't want to be hogging this space. I think the problem really is what I talked about before, because the entire system, you would normally have been defended by the judiciary, you would have been defended by the law itself, you would have been defended by civil society, you would have been defended by all the people and the structures which normally exist in a state which support citizens. I mean, I'll give you a different example. For instance, absolutely everyone in Bangladesh knows that this election was stolen. Yet, nothing's happened about it. 43 eminent citizens wrote to the president with very pointed observations about what the election commission was doing. It's not even bothered responding to it. And yet the same election commission is conducting more and more elections. So where do we turn to? The very systems that were meant to be in place to protect our rights have all been eroded. So the individual, the citizen, is on his or her own.
Yeah, I would agree absolutely with that. But my understanding, I'm not an expert on the detail of the Digital Security Act, but my understanding is that a big problem with it is that it's vaguely drafted. So it's open-ended and therefore open to interpretation. And they're always the most dangerous pieces of legislation when it comes to human rights, because then it can just be used as a tool which is very flexible in the hands of an authoritarian regime. So I think there's a real issue there around the Digital Security Act and the need for it to get amended in line with human rights law and standards. And we should be constantly reminding the Bangladeshi government that it is a party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So it is a signatory to that, and it has to be held to account on the basis of its commitments. And my heart goes out to those who are campaigning for freedom and democracy and freedom of speech in Bangladesh, because it's clear that it's been difficult to get people to overcome their fear and to come out and campaign. But that's why the role of the international community and countries like the United Kingdom becomes more important, because those who are on the ground in Bangladesh are clearly feeling intimidated and unable to speak out. But the fundamental problem, as I understand it, is that it's a very vaguely drawn act, and that is deliberate, of course, so that it can be used as a tool for repression, very flexibly and with impunity.
Just to add to what has already been said, there are certain areas like the authority that police has to search and arrest on suspicion, which makes it really, really broad, and also to search without a warrant. That is another problem. I'm just giving some examples because I understand it's not to get into a very lengthy legalistic discussion, but there are a number of problems with the definitions and also with some of the procedures. That's what the UN has been constantly pointing out. There are a number of briefings on that to say that at least there has to be some more clarity on the definition of what is, when we say harming public safety and things like that, how do we define that? Similarly, the powers of security agencies need to also be limited, because that has resulted in problems like disappearance for 53 days and then producing somebody later on. In addition to the whole question of impunity that was raised earlier, but the very draft of the law, the language gives a lot of space for scope for individual interpretations and excessive powers to the security agencies.
Yes, in terms of the way the law enforcement are interpreting it, a law enforcement official told Amnesty International that they see it as their responsibility to contain criticism against the government, which is very worrying in terms of democracy. So they're interpreting it as their role to protect the ruling party.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone. And I'm conscious before Stephen leaves to ask this question. It comes from Nigel Lloyd, and obviously I ask anyone else to jump in as well. But kind of, what is the impact, if any, of the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan? What might it be on Bangladesh?
Well, tragically, I'm afraid that authoritarian regimes all over the world will be emboldened by what's happened in Afghanistan. The message that is clearly being sent is that the West will not stand by you. It will not stick to its word. You can't really rely on them as credible and reliable partners. So if I were somebody who believes passionately in freedom in Taiwan and increasingly concerned about the increasingly aggressive behavior of China on the doorstep, I would be worried. If I were living in the eastern region of Ukraine and concerned about the incursions of the authoritarian state from Moscow, if I were even in one of the Baltic states and concerned about Russia, and precisely the same applies to Bangladesh. I see what has happened in Afghanistan as a tremendous setback for those of us who believe in progress and democracy, freedom, and for those of us who believe in a strong international alliance of free countries that stand up for the values and interests that we believe in. I would never have argued that there should be troops on the ground in Afghanistan forever, but the manner of the withdrawal, the chaotic and shambolic way in which it's taken place, is so it's so clearly cut and run, and not based on honoring the promises and obligations that we had made to those brave Afghans who stood shoulder to shoulder with ISAF and indeed the British diplomatic and political and humanitarian presence in Afghanistan all these years. If we can't even honor our promises to them, who can we honor our promises to? So I'm very sorry to give a bit of a grim summary of the situation as I see it in answer to Nigel's question, but I think that's the only conclusion we can draw at this time. What I do hope, though, is it will be a wake-up call, and that we will say, well, we can't just rely on the United States to do everything for us. We actually need to see Europe coming together. We need, perhaps this is the moment where the United Kingdom sort of wakes up and says, well, we've had a few experiences where we haven't always been consulted by the United States. We can't put all our eggs in the American basket. The world can't keep doing that. And I think, I hope that we will see some, the British foreign policy establishment will finally realize that the number one priority is to re-engage with our European partners. And through them, I hope to start then projecting some of the influence that we've been talking about today on countries like Bangladesh. So I hope, that as an optimist, I hope that this will be seen as a moment to genuinely reset the way we think about the world, the way the world works. But the more pessimistic side of me feels that in the short term, I'm afraid it's going to embolden the likes of the government in Bangladesh and in China and in Russia, etc. And so the short-term hit is going to be a very serious one indeed.
I'd like to approach that from a slightly different side. I think Afghanistan should never have been occupied. And when a country is occupied, it provides the opportunity for people like Taliban or whoever else to gather support, because people do not want to be occupied. In my case, in Bangladesh, what has happened is the support structures, the security, all the things that a citizen would normally expect from one's government is missing. And when that happens, it actually drives people towards the other alternatives. And Bangladesh has always been a very tolerant country. It's being pushed towards extremism by authoritarianism that is really depriving the citizen of the basic rights. And I think people don't get it. I mean, in a sense, this government has presented itself as someone who deals with the war on terror, but in fact, it is this very government that has promoted extremism in my country.
Well, thank you very much. We could definitely have a lengthy discussion about whether the action that was taken in 2001 in response to the 9/11 atrocities was the right thing to do. Unfortunately, I have to go now, but thank you very much for an excellent discussion, and please do stay in touch, and I'll certainly keep you informed of when I get a response from the government to some of the questions I've been asking about the Digital Security Act. And I wish you all the very best with your important work. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thanks, Stephen.
Before I move on, is there anyone else that'd like to come in on that question at all? Because it seems to be quite a potent one. No, cool. Actually, Huma, I had a question for you. Sorry. I wanted to home in on a little bit on what you said in your opening statement. You said about you wanted to see more regional action around a response to the Digital Security Act. What does that mean, and what does it look like, please? And how can we also engage regional actors as well, seeing as we haven't been able to engage them yet, I suppose?
Unfortunately, this region does not have a mechanism like Africa has, where you can have, or Americas have, or Europe has. Asia is one region that does not have any such mechanism at the moment. So one was to look at what could possibly be, and if there would be political will, if there would be interest for more regional mechanisms, for a regional mechanism in Asia in particular, because Asia does not have any. It's the only continent that does not have any human rights mechanism as such. And then the second approach, I was more thinking from the point of view of all the advocacy that is going on for various countries that were mentioned before by Stephen. Could we look at them as a group of countries with similar problems as well? Because all these countries have strong civil society voices, and perhaps if we could see how to campaign region-wide, that would possibly be also a useful tool, because campaigning for each country, I mean, that has its own importance, and I'm not putting one against the other, but I do think that that may have some more value in bringing these patterns together and to see how do we campaign on the regional level.
Interesting. Jerry, did you have something to bring in there? Sorry, I saw you look quite excited for a second. No, okay. Actually, I think this question follows on quite nicely. It's from the audience. It's from MD Razor Rahman, who says either for Jerry or to Huma, both, or anyone who wants to get involved, but they say that there's a strong need to organize all the victims of the ICT Act and the Digital Security Act, and kind of would it be possible to organize to organize it with the help of local human rights organizations and their defenders on the ground? Is this one possible way that we can look for kind of next steps and to kind of bring action to this debate?
So what's been suggested there is a sort of a campaign on the many victims as one campaign. Is that right? You see it? Okay, fine. That's a good idea, really, because Amnesty has highlighted the 10 cases which are important. It may be a good way to campaign to take a group of these cases and campaign on them in the traditional amnesty way, which is letters to the prisoner, letters to the government to get them released. So it would be taking actions on the individuals and it could be done in a sort of a group way. In India, there's a campaign for the BK16 who were all arrested together at a similar time on human rights work. That is a way that would engage, if you like, the amnesty activists. So yes, it is a good idea. It's worth considering.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. There's also a question that's come in from Rachel Taggart Ryan, who's asked the audience, he's asked everyone, can you comment on the effect of the acts on kind of religious belief minorities, including atheists who have been specifically targeted? But I'd like to just kind of broaden that ever so slightly and ask, are there any minority groups in Bangladesh that you feel are being specifically targeted by the act, or is it simply anyone that is willing to criticize the government? To the floor.
I think it is anyone who's not siding up to the government, basically, unless you happen to be a sycophant and part of the ruling elite. Essentially, you're someone who's in trouble. People who are minorities are vulnerable anyway. So within this power structure, that it makes it more difficult for them, not merely because they're minorities, but because they're lower down in the power structure chain, in the food chain, if you like. But there is another issue to be considered, and that is this government has actually gone out of the way to appease the religious fundamentalists in many, many situations. And it's played with that card, both in whatever direction has been necessary at any particular point. It's made alliances with them and it's persecuted them. So religion has actually been used as a political tool, making it that much more difficult for those of us who believe in a secular country, who believe that religious freedom should be part of the freedoms that we have. And that makes us even more vulnerable.
Thank you very much. And kind of on that as well, like thinking about kind of exercising our kind of religious freedoms as well as our political freedoms and our freedom of expression. Amnesty's briefing very, very unequivocally states there is no space for dissent online. And one of our audience members has asked, I think, to anyone in the audience, how can Bangladeshis on the ground or in Bangladesh actually show any kind of dissent? Is it possible? Is there any environment or any ways in which they can kind of criticize the government safely?
There isn't, but I think it has to be done regardless. And that's the reality we have to face. I mean, this is my country. Certainly, once I was arrested, they tried to make a deal. They said I would be released without charges, provided I was prepared to be silent. I turned it down. That's what led to the repeated persecution and incarceration and the 107 days that I spent in detention. But the point is, this is my country, and I, as a citizen of my nation, will exercise the rights that my constitution gives me. And I think this is what all of us have to do. At the end of the day, this nation was not something that came by itself. A lot of people sacrificed a huge amount for us to have this nation. And at the end of the day, it is up to every one of us. It is risky, it is dangerous, it has all those problems that you've brought about. We have to do so regardless. I think it is time that Bangladeshis began to take on the role. See, one of the very interesting things that came up when I started doing this documentation of the road safety movement was the students had a placard saying, excuse us for the inconvenience, we're trying to fix a failed state. Now that's what we're trying to do. That's what the students were trying to do. That's what we are facing. It is a failed state. And no one else, I mean, it's great that you're doing this. It's great that Amnesty is there. It's great that Labour is there, whatever. But at the end of the day, it is my country. And unless each one of us steps up to the plate, we cannot expect a foreign country or a foreign influence to save this nation for us. The onus is upon ourselves. As I speak now, I'm taking the very same risk that I took 3 years ago when I got picked up from this very place. I have to continue to speak regardless. It is dangerous, it's hugely dangerous. And of course, so many people have paid that price. Mushtaq was one of them, but there are many others. Kishore, I mean, I'm in touch with many of those people, they're suffering. And what people don't always also realize is while there is the physical abuse that they recognize, the psychological trauma that so many of these people have faced is something that is really not dealt with and really not recognized. And that is something that we all live with. But at the end of the day, we have to resist. It's never going to come by itself. Autocrats and tyrants do not give up by themselves. They have to be made to give up.
Can I just say, Shahidul was talking about it's the responsibility of people in Bangladesh to do, but we also have a role. I mean, I would say we, I think activists within the rest of the world, we certainly want to have a role in helping you, and it would be good to know how we can help you to stand up to these things.
Did you want to say something, Huma? I'm hogging the conversation here.
I think you are best placed to say how Bangladeshi activists like.
Well, but
Yes,
I will respond to your question if I may, and I'll give you a very specific situation. We've been trying to develop things, and one of the problems we've had is even the NGOs are worried about working with us. We're toxic. You know, donor organizations who work with us in private conversations say, well, you know, we can't get into controversy. We have to be careful. Can you word it differently? Can we not have our name in there perhaps, and all that sort of thing. So really, this climate of fear is not something that just affects us. It affects the entire community. And I agree with you, Jerry. I think we need to, it is that collective strength which allows us to resist. And neither you nor I or any of us will be able to do it by ourselves. But I think that solidarity, and I think it has to be a sustained action. It's not something that is, you know, you press a few buttons and it happens. It's going to take a long time. We need to accept that. We need to recognize that we're in there for the long haul, and there will be prices to be paid. That's the way it is, both for us and for you. But until those who want to support us are also prepared to take that risk and pay the price, we will not bring about a change.
Okay.
Just wanted to add that Human Rights Council also remains a place where there could be some more pressure exerted if there is more action at that level, because we've not had any specific resolution on Bangladesh, and I know that it's not going to be easy, but just as another forum for advocacy where we could possibly explore the possibility to push for more action.
And Huma, that kind of process of pushing for advocacy in the UN Human Rights Council, is that something that the international community, do you think, can help with? Is that potentially the role where the international community can come in? Because I want to just bring up a question from Mohammed Haq that came up earlier. He says that he's a Bangladeshi American, and in his opinion, the West is equally culpable in installing draconian regimes in our parts of the world. And he asked, what do you think the role of the West should be in preventing / overriding such policies in countries like Bangladesh? Potentially, is the UN Council on Human Rights one of these ways that we can override this? I think you're on mute.
Sorry, the first part of his observation is obviously a complex one and which will require a lengthy discussion. But in terms of using Human Rights Council as a platform, all the member states, I mean, any of the member states could ask for a resolution and gain support, because normally how it works is that how many member states are supporting a particular resolution, and possibly if that is one way, international community could definitely play a role in pushing a resolution on specifically either on the issue of accountability for freedom of expression globally, or a specific resolution on a country that is responsible for violations of freedom of expression or any specific violation, to have a resolution for the specific country asking for specific actions. Of course, there will be a lot of lobbying required to push that resolution, because the country against which a resolution is being brought also does its own lobbying. So, but it's not impossible. We've had resolutions against many countries like Myanmar. We've had resolutions. I mean, Myanmar, because it's recently been very much on the agenda, but there are many others. I mean, South Sudan, I recall from my memory, and past resolutions on Afghanistan, not on this particular crisis. So it's not impossible. It's also a forum, because if we look at the UN mechanisms, there is Human Rights Council, and then there is Security Council, which has its own complexities. Of course, a Security Council mandate or a resolution is considered much stronger because it's on peace and security issues. So it's formulated not only on human rights violations, but on threat to peace and security. That may not be applicable on the situation that is under discussion here in terms of freedom of expression, but a Human Rights Council resolution, definitely, because it's legitimately under ICCPR, and it is a violation of a human rights of a human rights treaty. So I think it's legitimate. I mean, it's possible to lobby for that.
Can I ask questions of Jerry and Huma, please?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Can I just clarify quickly? That was actually Safina Aman who asked that question. I got the person wrong. Apologies, but Shidal, please go ahead.
Jerry, I mean, Amnesty's played a remarkable role. You've put up these excellent reports. You've done in-depth work. It's really well researched and well formulated. But at the end of the day, the government just denies it. So what do you do afterwards? I mean, is it sufficient to do those reports? That's one. And a similar question to Huma, does the UN really have any teeth? Because, okay, you do all this stuff, you do tap them and, you know, go tut, that's not really very good, and they don't really care. So at the end of the day, we need to find practical mechanisms to do this. Merely telling people off and telling them they need to behave themselves and be good boys is not going to cut it.
Shall I start on that? Okay. I mean, our research is our strength. So, and that's always a good starting point, that we have people on the ground finding things out and doing that research. And that research does make increase awareness of issues throughout the world. But what do we do about it is these questions. How do we actually affect change? We know in the past we've affected change in terms of international pressure on individual situations, and that has worked. It's a matter of we constantly have to find new ways of doing that, though. You know, the traditional amnesty way was to write letters to prisoners, and that's what we were traditionally about, and getting people released. We also need to find ways of demonstrating that people in Europe care and will put pressure, and putting pressure on our own governments is very important. So by putting pressure on the UK government, by putting pressure here, we can make change, but it is a difficult process, you know. And I know it for people on the ground, it can sometimes seem as if that we're just saying tut tut, but I think international pressure does work in certain situations. But we always have to look at our strategy and improve it all the time.
In terms of the UN, we are an organization that is, our framework is member states. So it's an organization of member states. And every action that we can take in the framework we have currently is through the member states. So there is no, we don't have a police to start arresting people, or because it's a diplomatic organization in the end. So sometimes I know we have different impressions, and of course, I wish that it was the case, but the UN remains a diplomatic organization, which every action you have to take, it has to be agreed by member states, because I mean, someone like me, I'm an employee of the member states. So, and I mean, our deployments are based on the contributions made by member states. So we are very much tied to the whole idea of member states. And when a government in a particular member state decides to completely ignore or not take seriously its human rights obligations, it becomes quite complex in terms of actions that can be taken. In extreme situations, then we've had Security Council mandates. We also have ICC, but those are extreme situations, and they are more on international humanitarian law violations, much more than human rights law violations, in just the technical part of it. So it's hard to prosecute issues of freedom of expression. However, it's relatively easier to prosecute issues of, say, killing or in a conflict situation. For example, what happened in Myanmar is in International Criminal Court, because it's a conflict situation and it's violation of international humanitarian law in many ways. But what is happening in many other parts of the countries, other parts of the world and countries which don't have an active conflict, and therefore it's not violation of international humanitarian law. Not to say that those are not serious violations, but the framework that we have at the moment, it allows for prosecution in certain actions and not in others. And the growth, the development of our frameworks, because it's not that all this came in one day. It's been a process, and many new mechanisms have come up, and international human rights and humanitarian law also has grown. But that is another process that has to go through the member states. So as Jerry mentioned before, that lobbying, international pressure, bringing member states that would be sympathetic together to formulate more, if we think that there is a gap in international human rights law in terms of enforceability, then that's also work that has to happen with member states. Thank you.
Sorry, I might sound impatient when I'm saying this, but the reason I say it is because there are people dying here every day. This is a humanitarian crisis we're talking about. And of course, you might define it as not being a conflict, but it is a situation of conflict of the people versus a tyrant. And that is as much of a conflict as it can possibly be. And, you know, it's a house on fire. For us to be discussing policy and strategy when the house is burning, you really need to come up with something. We collectively, I don't have an answer necessarily, but I do think there are other ways of doing it. Certainly in the UK, there are MPs in the UK who have connections with Bangladesh, and I think it is meaningful and relevant to put pressure on them, for them to be accountable. I think there is the business community, and I think the people at large, because while governments behave the way they do, and quite frankly, while I don't know of any government that does not wax lyrical about democracy and freedom in its rhetoric and actively suppress it in its practice, so I don't have that much hope from governments. But the people are a community that I do have hope in. And I think we need to somehow, perhaps collectively, mobilize the people so they exert sufficient pressure upon their governments to ensure that it does not allow something like this to happen.
Yes, I forgot to mention the 4 Bangladeshi MPs, British UK. Yes, I agree with that. Okay.
Fantastic. I think with about 10 minutes left of the panel event, I think it would be really useful to go to some people in the audience who've had their hands up for quite a while and would quite like to ask a question. I'm going to hand it over to my friends on the tech side to bring them in. So we've got Rupert here. Rupert, if you're happy to ask the question, please do. You are on mute, by the way.
Many thanks. Thank you for that. I was actually going to ask a question of Stephen, but he's gone. But I'll sort of convert it for everyone else. The more I think about these issues, and I've been thinking about it for a long time with Shahidul, I've been going to Bangladesh since 1992, that external pressure is of limited value, but it's the only tool we've got, aside from the lives of people like Shahidul and other people who stand up to the regime, unless there is a sufficient power base in Bangladesh to resist the current government, and that's not going to happen in the near future. External pressure from our politicians over here, it seems to me to be the only practical answer. I don't think we're going to get commercial sanctions. And my question I was going to ask Stephen is, how can citizens, concerned citizens over here, Bangladeshi or plain English like me, what can we do to put pressure on the MPs? And what help can we get from people like Amnesty? I'm very happy to write letters like this, but at the moment, we are all facing a backwards movement in the freedom of expression worldwide. And it's just the same over here. So nothing like the position of Bangladesh, but freedom of expression over here is on the decline, as it is in the rest of the West. Stephen made the point very well. But that was the question I was going to ask. I don't know who else can add to that. Perhaps Jerry, you can say some words about that. And Shahidul, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And it's so good to hear your voice again.
We do have a standard letter for MPs, which I can send out to people. I promise to put my email address in the chat. I will. So that if you want that letter, I can send it to you. You can adjust it. And send it to your MP. And that's, as you say, is a good point. And as also, we've got the online petition as well. Okay.
Uma, is there something that people like Rupert can do with the UN?
I would again say to lobby with your respective governments to use UN platforms to put pressure, because directly and through UN platforms, as I said, Human Rights Council is a platform, or there are other platforms that are available. But though that's what I can think of at the moment for the situation of Bangladesh.
I would like to point out, thanks Rupert for bringing that up. It is important what people individually do, what people collectively do. For me, it was very important while I was in jail to know that there was a worldwide campaign for my release. And quite frankly, had that pressure not been there, I might still have been in jail. The case against me has not been dropped. I still potentially face 14 years in prison if I'm convicted. But the fact that I'm out, I think, owes a lot to the fact that people like Rupert and many people across the globe put that pressure in and made it difficult. So it does make a difference at that level. But what it also does, I think, is people-to-people linkages are important, and we collectively are much stronger than we are individually. And I think certainly the MPs themselves are people who need to be taken into account. They need to be made accountable for their actions. And in our particular case, there is at least one MP who has direct familial connections with the Awami League. And therefore, this is an MP who's been talking about human rights, defending human rights elsewhere. What is she doing about human rights abuses in Bangladesh?
This is very true. We haven't heard any really UK MPs be vocal on the subject as of yet, which is very unfortunate. Before we end, I just want to do a final shout out. If there's anyone who would like to ask a final question, please do pop your hand up on the Zoom window. And my tech connoisseurs will kind of help you pop you in the chat or help you pop you on the screen. Here we go. Mohammed Haq, please do go ahead with your question.
Hi, I am calling from Canada, Toronto. My name is Mohammad Mominul Haq. I am founder director for Peace and Justice Alliance. And actually, we are saying that Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and other rights groups frequently giving lots of statements. But the ground level people of Bangladesh witnessing that different way, that statement, Bangladesh present regime, they don't care about international statement. They are showing that fake economic development, and they are oppressing people's voice. Now we want actually real action to get human rights, democracy in Bangladesh. As you see, since 2009, the present regime keep power without real vote. 2014 and 2018, there are a lot of allegations about vote rigging and intimidation. So we want to thank UK part you are doing, and actually we frequently call to United Nations and other organizations that United Nations actually not doing their part properly. So they need to be more active. When you see any conflict crisis, we are getting more information. If you continue like this way, Bangladesh will face severe conflict and crisis, position and opposition. So people of Bangladesh, 85% people are poor. They need to survive. They need to live like a human. So our call to international community, urgent intervention, create a like a non-party caretaker government. So if people think we will vote this present regime or other party, then if there is a fair election, people will choose their representative. So give an opportunity to the people of Bangladesh for free and fair, credible election under international umbrella. So then people can choose their representative who will come to the power. People will feel that I given somebody authority to take decision about my life and livelihood. You can see many people are dying on the street. People are not getting benefit of the COVID-19 benefit. Only the present regime people are getting all the benefits. So do something, please, for the people of Bangladesh. Please try something.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohammed. That was really useful.
Giving me the opportunity to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you. can I invite any response from the panelists on this? And I think we've had an hour and a half of really incredible and interesting discussion, and I think it might be time to close the panel event to a close after some final remarks from the panelists. You're welcome to take the conch. No, fantastic. Okay, well, thank you ever so much. No, you'd like to go? No, please do.
No, I was
Sorry.
just again saying hogging all it, but I do really, I mean, I like what the last person said. And really, if all Bangladesh needs right now is for a government to be accountable, and at the moment it isn't, because it doesn't need the people's vote. It's very interesting. There was a Professor Asif Nazrul, who made a statement a few days back that had we a fair and free election in Bangladesh, then the situation of all these people fleeing on the planes is exactly what would happen with the ruling party. They would be hanging on to the planes to fly away. And of course, then the ruling party thugs locked up his office and threatened him. And there were all those sort of things. So again, we had to run a campaign for that to change. But in fact, today, if nothing else, if all that we could have is a free and fair election, I think it would dramatically change the scene in Bangladesh. And if we can somehow engineer that, that would certainly be a very practical solution.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very good note to end on there, a practical solution. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for coming this evening and for sharing their views and expertise. It's been absolutely brilliant to listen to and been extremely inspiring. If you haven't already, please do read the Amnesty briefing. It is incredible, gives a great overview and some really helpful recommendations. And as Jerry has said multiple times, write to your MP. If you're based in the UK, let's really get these MPs on board. You can follow us on Twitter to keep up to date with all the work that we're doing, and follow Amnesty Southeast Asia on South Asia, sorry, on Twitter too. And we hope you come back for our next panel event, which will be in the next few months, and more details to be shared on that soon. Thank you very much, everybody.